Hello folks, this is Geraths here. Today the focus of this demo is to show how to block in, layer paint, apply color and lighting and texture into a painting. My source material is a 16th century Italian palace garden in the mountains of Amalfi, Italy. Before I start painting, I want to show you my basic equipment layout. It's a basic small enamel tray and my transom box that has a sealable lid on it fits on the inside of it. So the basic layout is you have the whites and the warm colors on one side, and then as you move down, it goes into the cool colors and then into the basic earth colors. So if you look at the list, you'll see that there are some colors that are recommended and others that I just put in because it adds a little bit more spice to this color selection. I also added it so you could see the color selections I make as I dip my brush into those different wells. There'll be photos that will pop up for reference as I go along. And though I'm using a photograph, I'm going to try to interpret it more like a plein air painting because I've actually been to this place and done a couple of paintings that you'll see at the end of the demo. So one of the nice things with gouache is you can do transparent little washes and still at the same time come over it with fairly thick opaque impasto paint later on in the process. So that's what I'm doing right now is I'm blocking in the blue sky behind the trees, leaving holes for the light foliage, but at the same time I know that the darker foliage will be where the shadows are and where the tree trunks and branches will be coming up. So my last little move here is to mix a little bit of warm burnt sienna in with the blues I have up there and throw a little bit of a warmer touch to the sky where the clouds are. Okay, I got the sky blocked in. Now it's time to have a go at the house. Now they're getting a little bit of a raking light on that, and it's very warm and there's a lot of light there, but I don't want to overwhelm it. So I'm using a white, using a little bit of yellow ochre and some lemon yellow, and then I'm hitting the light side of it, and then I'm going to mix a little bit of blue in there, and it should sort of punch to the green a little bit, but I'm using orange, so it's a complementary color, so it's not going to overwhelm it. This is basically an underpainting. That's what I kind of use at this stage of the development in these paintings is I just kind of lay it in, knowing that I'm going to come over the top of it with other color choices later. You can see by putting that purple in, that's the cat shadow coming off the Italian cypress to the left. I'll be going back into this steeple on the left-hand side with much more of a less saturated neutral color. If you look at the photograph that'll pop up, it'll be very well lit, but I decided to let it drop into the background rather than having it sort of arguing with the foreground eventually. If you look at my palette while I'm painting this red tile roof, you'll see that I have this central pool of yellow that I use for the lit section of the house. And I'm sort of mixing all the other wet colors into that, knocking them down in saturation level and value level, coming in there with a little bit of orange because I'm going to paint this lower section that I deemed a little bit more dark. But I also know that I'm going to come over the top of that later with the raking shadow that is going across the front of the building. I'm trying to paint with as much speed and dexterity as I can. At the same time, I know that there'll be another layer going over the top of this. This is once again an underpainting. I'm just trying to get it down in the sense of like a plein air painting. I'm blocking in the big shapes and trying to get the local values and colors as close as possible, but still just moving on even if there's mistakes. One of the things about gouache is it's nice. You can sort of strategize later, and even if you're making mistakes, just move on and then fix it later. Okay, moving on to the tree on the right-hand side. Using a flat brush here, I've got a mixture of primary yellow with some winter green, fairly bright, fairly saturated. And now I'm going over the top of that sky I painted before, leaving some of those holes in there. And you can see that I'm not really concerned with painting over what I've already done, is because it's picking up a little bit of that paint anyways. And now I'm mixing a little bit of yellow ochre into it, a little bit of red, just as a complementary again, sort of knock those greens back a little bit, and then painting it over the top of the house. And I'm trying to keep the strokes like organized, but a little bit more on the staccato side. I don't want to make it all fall apart, so I have to make sure that I kind of group the leaves and the foliage into an understandable mass. Starting out with that same pool of color I have on my palette, I start mixing in some darker colors, some ultramarine blue, mixing in with the other ones. I'm going to go into the burnt umber and into the raw sienna, sort of punch that up a little bit. And it's getting a little bit brown there because on that side of the tree, there were more dead pine needles and such, and it gave it a sort of a nice warm undercoating to the form there. Sort of suggests also some bounce light coming off the ground. So this is a shadow shape here of a tree and some grapevines. And I don't want to make it overly too complicated. I'm just going to deal more with this as a shadow shape. As I kind of block it in using a little bit of ultramarine blue, maybe adding a little bit of light out towards the end of it, and then coming into the lower area where it's in shadow, and then adding a little bit more darker to it. Make sure I cut that area between the top of the grapevines and the, in a sense, the walkway that's underneath it. This tree over on the right hand side. So I don't want it to get overly too busy like the other trees because I don't want your eye to necessarily land on these too much. So I'm going to keep them flat shapes and then maybe come in a little bit later and then add a few branches, maybe some thin trunks of the trees or some support mechanisms on the grapevines. I don't know if I have any sort of central focal point at this time, but as you can see, as I'm building up my lights and the darks here, I'm trying to kind of harmonize it as I go along. One important part of the process is that I have a tendency to paint more towards the middle value range and then go for my lights and darks at the end of the painting, where once again, I make sure everything's working out right. So you might notice in the photograph that what I had here, there's a big gazebo there. So for the harmonizing and just the compositional part, I took it out. Makes a lot more sense to just put the grass in there. And as I'm even doing that, you'll see that the photograph, when it comes back in, most of this is dark. And I didn't want a really dark surface there. I wanted to get some light dappling through the trees onto the actual grass there. And so I'm making sure I keep the perspective right. Flattening out the back, and then as it comes forward, make the sky holes are on the ground have a little bit more room to kind of open up that area a little bit more. So I definitely want to make sure that I put the hedges in back there because to me it's a really good element of breaking up the space a little bit more from foreground to middle ground to the background. And so I'm putting a mixture together of ultramarine blue, winter green, and a little bit of burnt umber. Now I'm moving into the little flower beds on top. Once again, sort of breaks the verticals and horizontals out a little bit more. So now I'm going to move on to the most textured part of the composition, this little hedge back here with the flowers on it. In the photograph, you may notice the hedge is just green with a few little blots of flowers in it. Well, that would look really boring if I just sort of tackled it just like that. So what I'm doing is I'm adding Prussian blue, ultramarine blue. I'm throwing down some turquoise green right now, which I have a tendency to use in this area, and then cranking up the shadows a little bit more. Still keeping it in that similar value range. I'm not going too high or too low. I'm also, if you notice, I'm cutting little areas on the inside of the hedge that I know I'm going to be putting flowers in the future. If you look up at the palette, once again, you can see that my brighter colors are towards the top where the central kind of pool was made. And then I'm sort of mixing in down into the more darker and even complementary colors. Like I just mixed a little bit of burnt umber with the ultramarine with the greens, which sort of makes that sort of darker but a little bit more neutral color. The back part of the hedge, I'm painting a little bit flatter without the noisy paintbrush strokes in there. Because again, I wanted to go into the background. And I'm saving those more energetic strokes for the front part of the hedge that I can build up and then therefore it can become more of the foreground. Now I'm going back to this Italian pine tree and I'm going to paint in the branches. As you can see from the photograph, there are just way too many branches there to be able to tackle at one time. I wouldn't even want to paint them all in even if I could. The reason for it is it just would clog up the painting. So I grabbed a dagger brush here and I'm sort of mimicking what I interpret the way that the tree was built. And so you'll see those sort of more staccato strokes and I kind of break it at where the branches come together. And then again, one of the things I do is I try to look for the more important supportive branches and mimic those. Don't copy them. I'm just going in there, as you can kind of see. Even they're picking up the smaller, redder branches or raw sienna branches up in the upper part and mixing a mixture of raw sienna and blue for the trunk of the tree. Last thing out in here is the trunk of this tree, and while I've been painting everything else, I'm sort of blocking it in. This has just been giving me a lot of trouble, and I'm trying to figure out what color to do it because if you look at the photograph when it comes up, it will be very lit and very light, and I didn't want to do that. So what I'm doing is I'm using a little bit of the orange from the building and then laying in sort of a green cast shadow on it because the light's coming from the left-hand side, and I wanted to pick up a little bit of the light bounce off the other bushes. Character of this tree is completely different from the one on the left-hand side. Yes, they have the same elements, but this one you can see the skeleton of the tree, sort of the bones of it, are a little bit more dissipated, and it's the foliage, actually the tree crown, that has a lot more of the form to it, as opposed to the one on the left, where you can really see the underpinnings of the pine tree. So, like the last one, and you'll see when the photograph comes up, is I'm picking and choosing like where I want that structure to be. I want it to be harmonious enough and have enough of a rhythm to it where I will flow through it, but I don't want to make it overly heavy like I have on the one on the left. After getting the skeleton and structure in the tree, I want to give it a little bit more visual weight. So what I'm going to do is now I'm going to put some more texture and a shadow pattern into it. I do want to make that tree have a little bit more sort of oomph and a little bit more visual weight to it. So I picked up a fan brush here. It's coarse haired bristle. And what I'm doing now is I'm laying in sort of the texture and the shadowed areas. So again, it'll sort of, as you can see, the shadows will tip over to the right hand side of the composition. And I'm mixing up Prussian blue with a little bit of that Windsor green and whatever other junk I got in that brush at that point. And again, sort of hinting at the texture of it. I'm not painting a lot of individual leaves so you can see it in the photograph. I wanted to kind of blend in with everything else. Again, I'm trying to keep the balance of everything going at the same time. So I'm sort of planning ahead. Like right there, I'm sort of blasting like little holes back into the tree with the sky in the background. Um, just sort of moving back and forth. Now I'm back to the dagger brush and I add some white branches. Now, they're going to dry off pretty easily and they're going to sort of disappear back into the painting. But in reality, they sort of have a little bit more of the idea of the light coming into the tree. So I blocked the whole composition in and made my first pass on the trees just to get everything kind of lined up and giving myself a little bit of thinking room. So now I'm mixing up some burnt umber, burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue to get those dark areas, probably a little bit of green in there too, and making sure that the shadows from that tree come onto the branches there. Painting very fast. I'm not painting the branches slow, even though I've sped the film up a little bit here. But I'm moving fairly quickly because I want to make them look as spontaneous as possible. And then even the strokes that I'm putting on the top of the tree is hinting at the texture and hinting at the form. You can almost kind of see like it's a uh, large floating donut. And so all my marks are going cross contour. Okay, tackling the cast shadows on the side of the building and the architectural information. So I'm mixing up a little bit of a violet with the mixture I actually made for the branches, which is a burnt sienna and a ultramarine blue to get that sort of raking shadow over the top, and then using that darkness over there to get the roof line to hint at the chimney on the top of the roof and just kind of I don't want it to be like super straight lines and stuff. Number one, because it's an older building. Number two is that would completely uh, wreck it and separate it from the rest of the painting. So I'm trying to keep in a sense, the style of painting very similar so it doesn't become jarring to look at. Even the like I'm putting the windows in right now, these blues. So I'm sort of cranking the blues up a little bit. Even those, I want to make sure that yes, everybody sees their windows and doors, but I don't want to make them so exacting that they'll look like they've just been put in mechanically rather than similar to the rest of the painting. I add a little bit of jazz in between the building and the steeple there. So I mixed up this mixture of looks like a Windsor green and ultramarine blue and a little bit of burnt sienna there. And so what I'm putting in there now is the walls of the house are relatively flat, and now I'm using these more like little tiny choppy staccato lines. And if you notice, I didn't even mix a new mixture for the windows back there. They're so small, no one's not going to realize that they're actually green rather than just a dark. I don't paint with black, so all my darks are mixed from color. My favorite one is sort of a burnt umber and ultramarine blue for um, for foliage, it is Windsor green and flame red or primary red. At this point in the painting, I'm getting a little bit more confident about what is coming out. So I mix up this, again, a dark area. It's leaning more towards the Prussian blue and the green, and doing like little architectural pieces of information, like a little bit of the tile, cast shadows coming off the windows, a little architectural arch at the top of the doors and the windows, maybe even some little drop shadows. And if you notice that pesky tree that has been giving me a lot of problems, I don't paint the trunk lighter as I'm actually painting in back of it. Even on the walls, as you can see, I'm putting this raking light and shadows there. If you notice, it's a kind of a mixture where you can get the blues and the reds in there simultaneously, the warms and the cools. And I'm even hopefully getting a warm cast off the wall, that warm architectural brick that's there. Okay, moving on to the tree and the grapevines over on the left-hand side. And my general idea, what I'm going to do on this area is I'm going to start to kind of break down the lights and darks a little bit more. You can see there I'm hinting at the texture of the grapevines on top there. And the value is more in the middle as is the color. So it's sort of, you have the light, very light on the top, and you have the dark underneath the grapevines. And so what it does, it gives you a little segue in between the two, especially with the little strokes in between it. And you can see even here I'm adding like yellow ochre with the green and adding the texture of the individual leaves up there on that tree. And then coming down here into this dark area, I picked up the fan brush because it was a little bit too noisy. And so I wanted to break that down a little bit more. I'm also adding those light blue support poles into the grapevine and then cutting back in to the garden behind it, like little windows to give the idea of that there's some space behind there. And then use the same solution up there, and I'm adding individual leaves up on the tree. Again, even that, the pattern of them is supposed to help the composition of moving the eyes around. Give it a little bit more of a rough feeling to it. Putting some dry brush in there. Even the ambient shadow behind the poles there to give them a little bit more oomph. My eyes are just roving all over the composition, looking at little pieces of information that need to be put in. My eyes and brush are just roving all over the composition. I want to make sure that I don't get caught up in rendering details that aren't going to help, but might actually like peel your eye into a section that you may not want to see. So like right now, I'm just adding, I use that flat piece of bushes that I had there, and now I'm cutting actually into the tree and to the left of it and adding some sky color to it. That pesky tree that's been giving me problems. So I make up a mixture of looks like opera and some flame red and oranges. And once again, I'm not copying what I see on the photograph or even what I would see in nature. Is I'm going to help it move your eye through the composition. So you don't see any flowers at the end of the bush, but I'm going to put them there so to hopefully move through the perspective. Same thing with the little branches and leaves I'm putting in right now. That high contrast will sort of separate the hedge away from the vineyard in the back. You might notice that I left the white sections of paper in the painting at the beginning, very early in the block-in process, because I just knew that I was going to be putting these flowers in there and I wanted the contrast there. So at this point, again, I'm mixing up sort of a Windsor green with the Prussian blue, and I'm painting dark over light, and then in just a second I'll be painting light over dark. That's the one thing I like about gouache, is that you can really like push the different layers and techniques of painting. It's a very forgiving medium. You can start out really with large transparent washes of wet on wet, and then move all the way down to really impasto-like strokes you can even put on with a palette knife. Right there I'm going light over dark, and you can see now I'm kind of adding a little bit more texture and hints that there's individual leaves. And so you can layer it, and then you can see the glazes on the wall in the back or on the lawn on the right-hand side. It's very versatile material, very forgiving. With about 80% of the painting done at this point, I'm going to start jumping all over the place again to harmonize the painting. A lot of that will come down to like what I'm doing right now is I'm adding the warm areas right against the cool ones. I'm going to go into the architectural little information there, and sort of add rooftops, uh, little shadowed areas, a little bit of bounce light. You can see there I'm reinforcing the window joists in it. Even sort of knocking down that palm tree. I didn't like it very much, so I kind of eased it out. Reinforcing shadows. Like that's what I'm doing right now is I'm adding more darker shadows back underneath the grapevines. Using the same brush and color to hit the hedges where the shadows are, the contrasts. In general, it's just to sort of reinforce the textures and the sort of visual flow, some focal points. With this last little bit of brushwork here, just to kind of pull that tree on the right-hand side over the top of the building and hopefully maybe visually connect it more in with the pine tree on the left-hand side. Just a little bit more texture, just so the eye will flow through it a little bit more. Getting your eye to move through the composition is a really important element to me. Okay, so here's a grand unveiling, pulling the painter's tape off. And if you use painter's tape or start to, make sure that you pull it off at a 45-degree angle and slow. That way you don't rip the paper away from it. As we come to the end of this lesson, I'd like to thank everybody for hanging around and watching this painting demonstration. It was a fun little painting for me to do, and if you liked what you saw here, you can go to Gary Draws and Paints 7745 on my YouTube channel and subscribe. There's a bunch of tutorials and travel videos and all sorts of drawing and painting demonstrations. And make sure, like I said, subscribe, please comment, and hit that like button. You can also see a lot of other paintings on Instagram at Gary Geraths. And once again, I'd like to thank everybody for showing up and watching. Thanks again. Bye.